Hello, and welcome to the 741 channel. Thank you for stopping by. Today, we're going to take a look at replacing the chain and sprockets on my 2013 Honda NC700X. So over the winter, I decided to replace the tires. The old tires were these Bridgestone sort of dual sport tires. I don't ever take this bike off-road, so I decided I wanted to put some street tires on it. I ended up getting some Metzler Road Tech Z6s. When I went to put the rear wheel back on the bike, I started to go through the chain adjustment, and I realized that it was getting pretty close to the end of its adjustment cycle. So then I took a closer look at the chain, and I noticed it was starting to get a little bit of rust on it, and it just felt like it was getting a little bit stiff. I bought this bike used a couple of years ago. It has about 15,000 miles on it now, and I believe this to be the original chain and sprockets. So I figured it was time to change them. I've already removed the chain guard so I could have a closer look at the chain. And then also the back wheel is already loose, or actually I never retightened it from when I put it back on the bike when I got the new tire. So to get started with the replacement, the first thing I'm actually going to want to do is crack the front sprocket loose while I still have the chain on the bike and can put tension on it without having to rely on something else to stop the sprocket from rotating. Now, before I get at the sprocket, what I need to do is remove this cover. So that's what we'll do now. This cover is held on with a couple of bolts. There's one here inside this recess. I'm going to use an 8mm socket and pull this one off first. Looks like there's a second screw right here behind the shift lever. So I grabbed the shorter extension to get that one out. Looks like there's a third screw down here at the bottom, and it looks like the linkage is in the way. So we're going to have to pull this off to get the whole cover off of here. So we'll grab a 10mm socket to loosen up the shift lever. We'll go back to the 8mm socket and pull off this bottom bolt. Now the cover should come right off. There it is, all full of chain grease and gunk. So now what I'm going to do is I'm going to use this steel pipe wrapped with a towel wedged through the back wheel to kind of hold everything in place so that I can loosen the socket. Got the towel here to help protect the paint on the rim and the swing arm. I've got my 1/2-inch breaker bar and a 14mm socket. Let's see if we can loosen this up. Should be able to just back this out the rest of the way. Now that I have the sprocket loose, I'm actually not going to try and take it off just yet. What I'm going to do now is go grab my chain cutting tool and try and pop a link out of this chain while it's still on the bike and easily accessible. So here's a look at the kit that I got for the bike. You can see I got the super light sprockets, the DID chain, and the DID chain tool, all from Sprocket Center. So I'm not affiliated with Sprocket Center at all. I bought all this stuff myself after shopping around and looking at recommendations online and from other motorcycle friends who've used them in the past. So the next thing I'm about to do may not be necessary with this chain tool that I've got, but I'm going to do it anyway because I don't think it can hurt. What I'm actually going to do is try and grind off a bit of the head on the rivet with this Dremel tool, grinding wheel, just to help the chain tool a little bit. So now I'm going to set the U part of the chain holder behind the chain so that this hole right here is lined up with the back of the pin that we're going to push out of here. Then what I want to do is make sure that I put the cutting tool inside the shank here with this part facing out. And I'll back this down just enough so that this is protruding a little bit, but not pushing too far into the way and interfering with the chain. Now what I'll do is slide this over the U part of the chain tool. Not sure if you guys can see it or not, but there's a nut on the top of the tool and an A stamped into the U-shaped part. I'm going to line those two things up, and then I'm going to thread this in until this pin engages with the rivet that I just ground down. So I'll get that just kind of snugged up so it stays there on its own, and then I'll let you guys have a closer look at it. So I hope you guys can see what's going on here. Here's the back part of the tool, the U-shaped part. You can see it engaged with the front part of the tool. I've got the cutting pin set right over the rivet that I ground down. So now what I'm going to do is grab a 27mm wrench to hold the body of the tool and a 19mm wrench to turn the cutting part. So here's the 27mm wrench. I'll slide this over the tool body. And then I've got the 19mm wrench here. And we'll just start tightening this up and see what happens. I can feel the rivet coming out through the back of the hole in the U-shaped bracket, so I'll just keep pushing it until it comes all the way out. So hopefully you guys can see there's the old rivet, and now the chain is free. Now that the chain is out of the way, we can pull the sprocket off the rest of the way. So we got this bolt and washer here. This should just come off the splines. And there it is. So the last thing that we have to do in terms of disassembly is to get the rear wheel back off of the bike so I can pull this sprocket off of the wheel. So like I said, this is already loose from when I had the tire changed, so I just had it finger tight. So we'll just back that off, grab the washer and this bracket. I don't have a ton of room between me and the workbench here, so I apologize if this is hard to see. But the next thing I'm going to do is tap the axle out a little bit. Now it's over here on this side so I can grab it. And at the same time, I'm going to lift up the wheel with my foot. And I'm just going to kind of work this out of here. Now the rear wheel should just drop down and out of the way. So as you saw, I forgot to support the caliper before I pulled the wheel all the way off, and it kind of was hanging by the brake line. Should be okay, but we don't want to leave it like that. So I'm just going to move this up over here so that it's resting on the muffler and not putting strain on that brake hose. So now I'm just going to grab these chain adjusters, set them aside, and before I lose them, I'm going to grab these bushings out of the wheel and set these aside. Now I'm going to remove this sprocket using a 19mm socket. Okay, there's the old sprocket. So now that I've got everything disassembled, what I think I'm going to do is go through and thoroughly clean everything, especially the areas that I normally can't get to when the rear wheel is installed and the sprocket cover is on. Here's a look at the sprocket. I'm going to get this out of the package here. So here's a look at the two sprockets side by side. This, of course, is the old one, and this is the new one. They're both 16-tooth sprockets, and they're both more or less the same size, but slightly different design. You can see this one's got kind of a ridge milled into it, whereas this one is smooth. So I'm just going to bring this over, line up the splines, and slide it on. So now I'll install the sprocket hold down bolt, and I'm just going to finger tighten this for now, just to hold the sprocket in place. What I'll do is I'll torque it down in the end once the chain is installed, and we can hold everything from spinning. So next up, let's get the rear sprocket installed. So here's a look at the two rear sprockets side by side. They're both 43-tooth sprockets, and of course, just like the front, they are the same overall diameter. So while I had everything apart, I went through and cleaned this thoroughly, got all the old grease and grime off of it. I even waxed the inner part of the rim here. Anyway, I'm going to install this sprocket, and I'm going to orient it so that this ridged side and the side with the printing on it faces out. I'll just line the holes up and drop it in place. So now I'll spin these nuts on and get them finger tight. So now I'm going to use my 19mm socket, and I'm going to tighten these down a little more. So according to the factory service manual, these nuts need to be torqued down to 80 foot-pounds. I've got my torque wrench all set and ready to go. Got my 19mm socket. We'll get these guys torqued up. So that torque wrench wasn't quite big enough. I got my bigger one out, and I think we're doing okay now. Now, one thing you may have noticed is I skipped every other bolt when I torqued this up, and that's to try and keep the pressure on the sprocket even so that it doesn't end up warping as I tighten it down. So next up, let's get the rear wheel installed on the bike. The first thing I'm going to do is reinstall this washer with the large shoulder on it on the sprocket side of the rear wheel. Next up on the caliper side, I'm going to reinstall this spacer, and same thing, this is just going to kind of clip into this rubber boot and will stay in there by friction. Next up, I'm going to reinstall my chain adjusters, and I'm going to make sure that the side with the markings on it faces out so that they're visible through these windows once everything is assembled. So before I had taken the rear wheel off, I actually had removed this caliper. I reattached it to the bracket, but I never actually fully tightened these bolts down. So what I'm going to do now is just pull these out since they're in here finger tight. The bolt on this side used a 12mm socket, and the one on this side closest to the hose uses a 14. So next up, I'm going to bring the rear wheel in with the sprocket facing the left side. I'm going to position the wheel so that the sprocket assembly is close to the left side of the swing arm, and so that there's a gap on this side. So now I'm going to bring in the caliper bracket, and I'm going to line up this slot that you see right here with that flat-sided pin that's welded on the inside of the swing arm. And I'm just going to slide that over for now and get this hole roughly aligned with where the axle is going to go through the swing arm over here. Now I'm going to grab the axle, and I'm going to make sure that this bracket is all the way over here on the left towards the head, and I'm going to get this started in the hole for the left side chain adjuster. Okay, hopefully you guys can see this well enough. I'm going to sit here with my legs outstretched, and I'm going to lift up the rear wheel so that it roughly aligns with the axle, and I'm going to start to kind of work it through until the axle is in the bushing of the wheel. Now I'm going to use my knees to kind of position the wheel so that it's straight and so that the axle slides through. So what I'm going to do now is grab this rubber hammer to kind of tap on the axle and give it some gentle persuasion to make its way to the other side. Once I notice that it starts to emerge from this side, I'm going to start to position everything so it's all lined up. Now that I've got the brake caliper bracket lined up, I'm going to tap it again, keep an eye on it. I don't know if you guys can see it, but the axle is now through the caliper bracket and just about to go through the chain adjuster hole. So what I'll do now is get the chain adjuster lined up, and then hopefully we can tap it the rest of the way through. So now I'm going to install this other black bracket, this washer, and then I'm just going to finger tighten the nut onto the axle for now. So the rear wheel is now installed, and I can slide it forward and backward as needed to adjust the chain once that's installed. Now I'm just going to spin it and make sure that there's nothing binding or hitting anywhere. Now we're ready to install the chain. So this is a little bit easier to do. If you have an older chain that you're removing, you can hook the new chain to the end of the old chain and drag it through. But since I disassembled everything, I'm just going to have to start from scratch here. So you can see here I put a piece of cardboard on the floor just to protect the chain from picking up dirt from the floor. And I've got it worked over the rear sprocket here. I'm just going to kind of drag it through and guide it through the bike and get it wrapped around the front sprocket here. I'll make sure that I get the teeth engaged and then just kind of walk it over the sprocket. Grab it from the bottom and just kind of slowly walk it through. Now I'll bring the free end around and wrap it around the sprocket so that the two ends meet and sort of stay on the sprocket here. Now to keep the wheel from spinning, I'm just going to bring back my towel wrapped pipe and jam it through here. Now the wheel won't spin as I try to put the chain together. So next up, let's get the master link ready to go here. The first thing I'm going to do is grab this packet of grease that was supplied with the kit. I've cut a corner off so that I can squeeze a little bit out, and I'm going to put some on the pins of the master link. Now what I'll do is grab an O-ring and put a little grease on this. I'll slide this down over the pin and get it seated down against the plate. And I'll do the same thing for one more O-ring. I'll spread some of that grease around on the O-rings so that everything is nice and coated. Now we'll bring in some grease and work it into the holes on the two links. So now we'll bring the link in with the two O-rings on it and install it in the chain from the back. So next up, I'm going to use the grease pack and put some grease on the two remaining O-rings and then slip them over the free ends of the rivets. Now I'll bring the outer plate in and press it over the rivets as much as I can. Now I'm going to get the chain tool set up and ready. First I'm going to grab this part of the tool and I'm going to take the end that I used to push the rivet out before, flip it around and put the plunger into the body of the tool so that this end is just barely protruding. Now what I'll do is bring the U-shaped part of the tool in and line up these depressions on the body of the tool to the rivets on the back of the chain. Now I'm going to slip the main part of the tool over the U-shaped part, and I'm going to line this nut up to the A that's engraved in the back part of the tool. Now I'm going to bring in the press plate, and I'm going to align this depression up with the plunger. Now that everything is lined up, I'm just going to slowly tighten this up while making sure that nothing goes out of position. I have my 27mm wrench on the back, my 19mm wrench on the front, and I'm going to go ahead and start tightening this up to seat the plate. So I tightened it up just enough until I felt everything kind of bottom out. Now I'll back this off and take the tool out, and we'll check and see if the plate got seated properly. So visually everything looks okay. Now I'm going to take the press plate from the tool, and I'm going to line it up between the outer plate of the master link and the adjacent links to make sure that everything is seated evenly. Now what I'll do is check and make sure that everything is moving freely. So next up, we're going to use the riveting tool to peen over the head of the rivet and set it in place. So I'm going to bring back the back part of the tool, then I'll bring in the main body of the tool, and I'll make sure that it's lined up to the A this time. So now what I'll do is tighten this up until it just barely engages the pin, and then I'll make sure everything is aligned. So once again, I'll bring in the 27mm wrench for the body of the tool and use the 19mm wrench to tighten up the rivet head. Once again, I've tightened until everything bottomed out. Now I'll back it off and do the other pin. I've spun the chain around so that the link is on the bottom of the chain now, just for easier access. I had been working on the top previously, just so I had better camera angles so you guys could see what was going on. But this one, I'm going to do the easier way. So now, just to check and make sure that these rivets are seated properly, I'm going to bring in my rivet tool, and I'm going to place it over each of the rivets and check and make sure that it sits flush against the plate and doesn't rock or pivot. Looks like that one's okay, and looks like that one's okay too. I'm just going to bring back my towel wrapped pipe and jam it through here. So now I'll torque this front sprocket bolt to 40 foot-pounds. So now it's finally time to set the chain tension and wheel alignment. So there's a few different ways to set the alignment of your rear wheel. So what I like to do is use the tick marks on the chain adjusters to get everything sort of in the ballpark in terms of alignment. And then I use my alignment tool to just do the final touch-up and make sure that everything is as close to aligned as I can get it. These chain tools are readily available and relatively inexpensive, so I'll leave a link down below if you need to check this out further. Now this process can be a little bit tricky, and you may need to iterate through it a few times to get everything just right. But it's important to get the rear wheel aligned as close as possible so that you don't have any handling issues with your motorcycle, and to prevent uneven drive wear and tire wear. And it goes without saying that if your rear wheel is not aligned with your front wheel, your handling is going to be off, and that could cause an unsafe condition. And of course, I want to set the chain tension to factory specifications, also to maximize chain and sprocket life, and just to keep everything running within manufacturer's specs. So I've got the chain adjusters on both sides of the axle just finger tight right now. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a look at how many tick marks are visible between the front of this plate and the opening in the swing arm here. And then I'll kind of adjust and align everything so that I see the same number of tick marks on this side of the bike as I do on the other side. Now that I've got the rear wheel roughly aligned, I want to double check and make sure that I don't have too much or too little slack on the chain. So the slack adjustment for this bike is between 1.2 and 1.6 inches. And just based on feel, I think we're sort of in that ballpark. It may need to tighten up a little bit. The next thing I'm going to do is bring my alignment tool in. I'm going to slip it over the chain back here at the sprocket and clamp it down over the sprocket so it's sitting flush and square on the sprocket sides. I'm going to look from the back of the bike down the adjustment rod and verify whether the chain is centered or not. Let's take a look. What I'm going to try and do now is line up the chain to the rod by using the chain adjusters to slide one side back and one side forward until I get this perfectly aligned to the rod. So I've got everything pretty well aligned now, and just by feel, I think I'm pretty close on the chain tension too. But just to be sure, I'm going to measure it. So now for this particular bike, the chain slack should be checked with it on the side stand. So I'm going to have to double check this again when I'm done with the job. But for now, so that I can get everything finished, I'm going to just check it on the center stand and then fine-tune it later if I need to. So to check the tension, I'm going to use a tape measure and butt it up against the swing arm, and then I'm going to just pull down any slack that might be in the chain, And then I'll note the measurement to the center of one of the chain pins. So in my case, it looks like it's at 2 inches. Now what I'll do is push up on the chain and note the measurement to the center pin. So in my case, it's about 1/2 inch, but I'm bottoming out on the swing arm, so I think there's a little more slack there that could be taken out. I'm going to tighten everything up and then check it again. So when I tighten everything up to try and maintain the alignment, I'm going to pay attention to the number of turns I make on this adjuster, and then turn the other one the opposite direction, the same number of turns, and hopefully that'll maintain the alignment. After iterating through the alignment and tensioning process a few times, I think I finally got everything dialed in where I want it. Now I'm just going to tighten up the rear axle nut to lock the rear wheel into place. Now that the axle is tightened down and the rear wheel can't move anymore, I'm going to lock down the chain adjuster nuts. Before I set the torque on the rear wheel, I'm just going to spin everything here, make sure it's running true and smooth, no binding or rubbing or anything like that. Now that I've got everything aligned and tensioned the way that I want, I'm going to torque the axle nut to 72 foot-pounds, which is what's recommended in the manual. Now I'll reinstall the brake caliper assembly. The first thing I need to do is put this clip back over the bracket. Then I'll take a little bit of this Napa Sill Glide and I'll put it in the boot. Then I'll get the brake pads back in position and separated, and then bring this down and slide it over the rotor. Then what I'll do is push this boot in a little bit so that the front mounting ear will slip over it. So now I realize you guys can't see this because the muffler's in the way, but I'm going to get this in position so that the brake pads are resting on the clip that's at the front of the bracket, and that the front mounting ear is lined up with the boot. Now we'll add just a little bit more of the Sill Glide to the front caliper pin, which is the bigger of the two. Now I'll bring this caliper pin in and get it through where it needs to go. I want to make sure that it slides through the boot properly and doesn't bind or pinch on it. Now I should be able to get the threads started and start tightening this up. So for now, I'm just going to snug that up just so it's tight. And now I can pivot the caliper forward on that bolt. And the reason I want to do that is because I want to pop out this caliper slide and add a little bit of grease in there to lubricate it. And now I'll add some fresh grease into each side of the boot. So now I'll add a real thin coat of grease to the bushing. So I realize this will be difficult to see in the camera, but I want to slide this through until the grooved end of the bushing pops through and locks into the rib that's on the inside of the boot on the far side, and then push it a little further and then get it to lock into the boot on this side. So I had to kind of push it back and forth a few times to get those ribs to lock into the grooves, but everything looks good now. I have a little too much grease on there, so I'm going to wipe off the excess. So I'll make sure the pads are still in the right position, and then pivot this down until the rear boot is aligned with the hole in the bracket. Now I'll install the rear caliper pin through the bushing. So now I'll bring in a 12mm socket and tighten that up. Before I torque everything up, I'm going to spin the wheel and check for any dragging or binding of the brakes on the rotor. Everything seems good, so let's torque these bolts down. So it's a little hard to get in here with my torque wrench, but I'm going to torque the caliper pin bolt to 22 foot-pounds according to the manual. And then I'll tighten the rear bolt, which is here behind the muffler that you can't see, to 16 foot-pounds. So this chain isn't dirty, but it is new, so it's got a light coat of oil on it to protect it in shipping. So what I'm going to do now is just kind of wipe off that surface oil to get ready to add my own chain lubricant. So the chain lube I chose to use is this PJ1 blue label. So I'm just going to get this shaken up and we'll get it applied to the chain. So I'll use my master link as a reference so I know where I'm starting from. I've got a rag behind the chain to protect any overspray from getting on the rim and tire, and to catch any drips that might otherwise fall on the floor. So we're finally getting close to the end of the process here. I've got the front sprocket cover all cleaned up. I'm going to install that now. So next up, I'm going to bring back the shift lever linkage and get that installed. And this is something I may need to readjust and reposition once I'm able to sit back on the bike and figure out where my toe is going to be in relationship to the shift lever. But for now, I'm just going to put it back about where I think it used to be and go from there. Last part of the reassembly process is to put the chain guard back on. So that's going to wrap things up for replacing the chain and sprockets on my 2013 Honda NC700X. If you want to learn more about the products I used in this video, check the links in the description below. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a thumbs up. If you'd like to leave a comment or subscribe, feel free to do that as well. If you'd like to support my channel in another way, please consider visiting my Amazon store, which is linked in the description below.